Okay, let's see if I can finish up here chapter 4. We've been on this for a while here, but we're on slide number 50. Let's talk about the problem of task theology. Okay, so if you remember, task theology is theology written by a biblical author dealing with the task at hand. Okay, a great example is Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, the first one. You know, there was a lot of tasks he was dealing with. What about this issue? What about that issue? What about this? And so theology comes at us in the epistles not as systematic one after the other theology, but you're going to get bits and pieces. In other words, you're going to get a lot of end times theology in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, because that was some of the questions and the issues that Paul was addressing, okay? But you're not going to get, theology about the atonement a lot of times in Thessalonians, okay? In other words, that reflects this idea of task. There was a task at hand, and so you've got to understand that as you're trying to interpret the epistles, okay? So again, if you look at slide 50, it's just this idea that there's no systematic representation of theology in the epistles. You've got to learn to kind of differentiate the two and understand those as you're doing that, okay? One must always be forming and reforming a biblical theology basis on the basis of sound exegesis. We readily acknowledge a given writer's theology is found in his presuppositions and the implications, as well as his explicit statements, okay? So going to slide 51, cautions when using task theology given the occasional nature of the epistles. Again, the writers of the epistles, the epistles themselves were occasioned by a particular issue. That's what they're talking about when they say the occasional nature of the epistles. Because the epistles are occasioned either by the author or the recipients, we must be content at times with some limitations to our theological understanding. That's the first point, okay? For example, to get the Corinthians to see how absurd it was for them to have two brothers going to a pagan court for judgment, Paul states that Christians will someday judge the world and angels. Okay, so in other words, you're not going to go to that section and go, okay, now what does it say about angels and judging and develop a whole huge theology on that, because that was incidental to the main point, two brothers going to court before pagans, okay? So beyond this, about Christians judging the world, the texts say nothing. Thus, we may affirm as part of Christian eschatology, our understanding of final events, that Christians will in fact exercise judgments at the eschaton, at the end of time. But we know very little as to what this means or how it's going to be worked out, okay? Anything beyond that is mere speculation. If you hear a Bible teacher just going off on the scripture because he gives all kinds of examples and specificity about it, okay, reject it, because again, it's speculation, okay? We don't know, and you've got to understand that, okay? Going to slide 52. Similarly, Paul argues from the nature of the Corinthians' own participation in the Lord's Supper that they may not likewise participate in the meals at the idol temple, okay? What Paul says about that participation seems to go beyond the theology of the supper found in most evangelical Protestantism, okay? Here is not mere remembrance, but actual participation in the Lord himself. From other New Testament texts, we may further argue that the participation was by means of the Spirit and that the benefits came by faith, okay? But even here, we're going outside the immediate texts to express Paul's understanding in a theological way, and many will probably not agree with our choice of outside texts, okay? Our point is that we simply are not told what the precise nature of this participation is and how it comes to benefit the believers. Again, you're thinking of consubstantiation and the Last Supper or the communion, is it a memorial? What is it? In other words, there's all kinds of controversy in Lutheran churches and in evangelical churches and in even Pentecostal churches as far as what is communion. But again, to look at it in the text, you can't derive that from the text. At best, it's incidental to it, okay? Other cautions involving task theology, given the occasional nature of the epistles, slide 53. Our knowledge is defective precisely because of the occasional nature of the statements. Okay, what is said beyond what the texts themselves reveal cannot have the same biblical or hermeneutical import or emphasis as what can be said on the basis of solid exegesis. We are affirming that in Scripture, God has given all we need but not necessarily all we want. We've got to recognize that, okay? Slide 54, okay? Sometimes our theological problems with the epistles derive from the fact that we are asking our questions of the texts that by their occasional nature are answering their questions only, okay? When we ask the text to speak directly to the question of abortion or remarriage or infant baptism, we want them to answer the question of a later time, and they're not doing that. So we've got to be careful about that, okay? Sometimes they may do so indirectly, but often they will not, because the question simply has not been raised back then, okay? There is a clear example of this in the New Testament. There was a question raised, the idea of divorce, okay? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10, "Not I, but the Lord," meaning Jesus himself spoke to this question, okay? So in other words, you just have to differentiate that, okay? Now in saying that, can I think we can make a clear case against abortion from the scripture? Yes, I think we can. Although the scripture doesn't specifically say, now concerning abortion, this is what it says, okay? I think Psalm 139 has a great example of that, this idea that God knew us before we were knitted in our mother's womb, okay? There's an example. But there's nothing specific mentioned there, okay? And then finally, slide number 55, okay? But to the question raised in a Greek environment as to whether a believer should divorce a pagan partner, Jesus apparently had no occasion to speak. That's why Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, okay? When Jesus talked about marriage in the Gospels, he's talking about from the concept of the Jewish standpoint. Again, Jews in marriage, okay? Wasn't talking about Jews or a Christian to a non-believer, okay? That question was not raised to Jesus, but it was raised to Paul, and so he addressed it in his letter to 1 Corinthians, I believe in chapter 7, okay? One of the problems, of course, is that we ourselves possess neither Paul's apostolic authority nor his inspiration. The only way we can speak to such questions is on the basis of a whole biblical theology that includes our understanding of creation, the fall, redemption, and the final consummation. In other words, we need to bring a biblical worldview to how we understand some of these issues, okay? Psalm 119, verse 160, I believe it is, okay, says, "The sum of thy word is truth." And that is a great exegetical principle, okay? In other words, if you're trying to understand a particular principle, okay, try to look at what the entire panorama of the scriptures say about it and not just narrow in on that one particular text, okay? Because again, if you can find that there is reinforcement throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, again, a great example is homosexuality. It is really clear, okay? You have to be bending scripture like a pretzel to say that homosexual conduct is not prohibited by God, okay? So in other words, if you see it throughout the scriptures, in particular in the Old Testament and the New Testament, for goodness sakes, it's really, really clear. It is an act of disobedience and wanton rebellion against God's authority to think otherwise, okay? So I hope this helps you for chapter 4 here, going through the epistles. Again, I think this is the most important chapter in this whole book because as you can see with the wealth of material, there's a lot covered there. And I added some of my own stuff from my own personal research that I think helped fill out this chapter as well. So hopefully this was a blessing to you. Hopefully it helped you understand this a little bit better. Obviously, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to help to answer any questions you might have. Okay, take care. Blessings.